Good morning and welcome to this week's Jump discussion on recruitment. And this week we're looking at, have you had the time to train, or were you too busy trying to hit your target? As we know, leaders, managers, team leaders, big billers and even solo owners, if you're not training to improve, then the normal comment is that you're probably going backwards. So this week we're going to look at why coaching and training, especially utilizing your leadership spine, is a must. So I'm joined by Paul and Martin. Heather is sunning herself on holiday. It was quite interesting when we were sort of who's on this week. She just put a picture of the just ridiculous. Hate her. Okay, and Dave is speaking at the Talent event in London. Although we've just found out that he's not sure what he's speaking about, but he's definitely speaking about something. So let's kick off. I've got a feeling that today's going to be quite a lively session. There's going to be quite some lively, I think some quite controversial comments about billers and big billers managers and training and mentoring and what's going on. So let's kick off and get into it. So if a billing manager's only leadership style is what I do, how are you going to coach them to actually develop people instead of just expecting them to copy success?
I think copying success is going to be absolutely the wrong move. Look, I think all of us think back to our early years in recruitment, and understandably and correctly, we were like through osmosis, we were soaking stuff up from other people around us. That's great. One of the things that's kind of missing in today's market is the fact that we work from home a lot of the time. In many businesses, that happens every week. So you don't necessarily get the benefit of soaking up best practice from people around you, or indeed some of the things that, and I remember very clearly looking around me that I wouldn't do certain things that I was watching around me. So, but just being around people was in itself an education. But the fact is, we're now working more distantly, as it were, from the office, and coaching is so important. So therefore, this issue, the tenet that you're going to learn from other people, isn't quite as valid as it used to be. I think you've got to, and we're going to get into this today, Howard, aren't we? That it's really the mindset of people recognizing that coaching is a lifelong, discipline that we need to imbue in our people. It's not something that just happens when people join a business. And often the people that need the most coaching and training, bizarrely, are the people that have been with you the longest, because they become set in their ways. And they do the things they've always done, hoping for the same or better results. And we all know what that means. So it's actually, as a leader, making sure that everybody in the business is consistently coached and trained. And so I think that this point about leading by example is a good one. But if you consider that if you're talking about billing managers, their heads are down trying to make money. And again, I think we'll talk about that shortly. But it's also about making time in the day and indeed every week to spend with people one-on-one and in group sessions to ensure they're correctly coached and directed.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Paul. I think the fact that it says do what I do, is that the only leadership style? I think that's when the challenge comes, if it is the only leadership style. There is a time and a place for copy what I do. But I always think back to how we learn and our individual career paths. We started off, well, I did. I was fortunate enough to have a really good mentor who taught me the basics and foundations of a day planner, how to structure a sales call, how to use the CRM, all the basics. And it was only after I'd mastered that I was able to bring my personality to it and to play around with that kind of fixed and flexible part of recruitment. And if you just look at a seasoned, experienced recruiter, you might not see the years of experience and foundation that went into allowing them to be themselves. And if you just copy them, you're ignoring all of that hard work that goes in to build that solid foundation. And it's kind of relevant for me now because I've got a daughter who's just about to turn 17. So, Daddy, can I have a car? Can I learn to drive? And can you teach me? And if I sat in the car with her and said, just do what I do, she'd fail her test completely. Because I check my mirrors every time? I'm a good driver. I've never crashed my car. But if you just copy what I did, you'd ignore all of the basics I had to learn to give me the confidence to be able to then apply my personality. So I think there is a time and a place for do what I do, but it ignores all of the hard work and the basics that you also have to do on a really regular basis.
So Martin Ewing's known as Martin Ewing's never had a crash, but looked in the mirror and seen loads behind him. I think the conversation is very straightforward on this. I think if you're not passing on your knowledge, then you're creating not creating a culture of collaboration and development. So I think what you said in the beginning, Paul, with people working from home, there's a thing. What you're doing is you're creating a sort of a culture of one for all for one type scenario, and therefore your mid players, that the ones that need the coaching, and sometimes your senior players that need the coaching, tend to fail and walk away. And I think the conversation is about everyone's different and everyone has a different thing. I think your comment there, Martin, is really interesting, that, you know, learning by osmosis is really hard because you don't see all those little things. You don't see those little minute details that people do really well, and you're not picking that up. So I think we've got to start to create a coaching culture, because everyone's different, and understanding people's differences and their own, I suppose, independent flair becomes in. So I think keep teaching those core basics are really important, and that's what I think a lot of recruitment companies are reasonable at doing. But then developing the person beyond that is that where it becomes really hard, and that's when your managers, your team leaders, your owners of the business, I don't think they get close enough to really understand what actually makes that person tick, and therefore they just rely on copy what I do, it'll be fine for you, when it's not. And I think that's the bit that they tend to forget, that, you know, everyone's different, and you've got to have a valid reason to why you want to change somebody's habits, and they can see what that habit creates in the long run. And I think that's what we tend to forget. We tend to forget that everyone has a different habit for doing certain different things, and it's those habits that we need to break and retrain or develop. And that's the bit that if you're not close enough to your team, you'll never actually understand the habits that those people have got. So the next question then, this is the one that I come across quite a lot, and I've sort of tried to broker this down with a number of clients that I'm dealing with at the moment. And, you know, it's interesting, we were talking early on about Dave and I are working with a client that's got 7 offices across the country, and this is one of the things that has been thrown at us constantly, is how do you challenge leaders who believe being busy is a valid excuse for not coaching and training their team?
Well, you know, the thing we love about recruitment is that you're constantly busy. You know, I always say jokingly, but I kind of mean it, that if you're bored with recruitment, you're bored with life. I mean, there's always something that's going to be happening to you and stuff that you're creating. It's one of the great things about our industry. It's constantly busy. And in fact, if you're ever at a point in the end of the day where every box on your to-do list has got a tick in it, you're not working hard enough. The fact is that there's always a lot to do. This comes down to priorities. Well, you can always find the time to do the things that we prioritize. That's true in life, let alone in our business lives. And so I think this is a choice. People choose not to train. They choose not to do these things. I don't even necessarily think it's a subconscious choice. I think it's a conscious choice that they choose to do other things other than train people. And I do understand it. Everybody's under tremendous pressure. We're going to talk about that, you know, making targets, especially at this moment where it's difficult, life's a bit challenging from an economic perspective. One understands totally that we have to be dedicated to making fees. That's our very purpose. But the fact is that it's a lot easier if you're prepared to put time and energy into the very people that you engage, because we always say that the greatest investment that any business makes, we say this to our clients, are in the people that we employ, that they employ. Nothing else comes close. We can talk about tech and AI and all those things are super important, but nothing is going to usurp the importance of human beings and people. So we get these highly expensive products into our business, and then we essentially ignore them. We don't maintain them. If you think of it like a machine, we don't maintain them. But back to your car analogy, Martin, you know, we don't service them regularly in terms of changing their oil and tappets. I don't know how you put this. I'm sure I'm going to go off on the wrong tangent. But the bottom line is, we bring these expensive bits of kit, human beings, into the business, and then simply don't do much to develop them, look after them. In many instances, not saying it's true everywhere. Now, it should be our number one priority. We should be expending time and energy into our people every single day in a variety of ways, and every week in a number of different ways, and every month in a number of ways. And if we fail to do that, then ultimately we're going to remain busy, because we're going to consistently struggle to meet the targets we set for ourselves, because the people who work for us or with us are not going to be able to work at their optimum level. So, if you make a choice to bring people into your business, if you're not a solopreneur and you have people in your company, you've made a choice too that you have to put time and energy, not just every now and then, but every single day into those very valuable people that you've brought into your company. And that's not just in terms of their ability to produce for you, but the cost of bringing them in. They're not cheap. We know how much they cost. The biggest outlay for any organization, aside from rent, and that's less of an issue these days in many instances, is the cost of people. And we know that that's gone up recently after the government increased NI contributions. So given how much people cost and their potential to make you money, surely that should be your number one priority.
Yeah, I think the key here is differentiating between what's urgent and what's important. And it's really easy to get sucked into what's urgent and what's the noisiest thing on your desk, as opposed to taking a breath and thinking, what's the most important thing for the long-term plan of my business? And you're absolutely right, Paul. If you're fortunate enough to be able to hire people into your business, you should do so partly because you have a vested interest, if not a passion, in wanting to develop and grow those people, not just for the good of them, but for the good of your business. It helps to scale if you get the right people in with the right skills. And it's an investment, and it's not just an investment in cost, it's an investment in time. And you've got to plan your day, your week, your month to give time to the development of those people. And if you're really fortunate and you've got people in your organization of a scale where you can have team leaders or individuals that are coaching people below them, don't just put big billers into those roles. Define that role where development and leadership of staff is if not the key part of that job description, and reward and recognize success against that person being a good leader and developer of people, not just a personal biller themselves.
I think Martin and Paul, you both hit on a point there. And as Paul was speaking, I wrote down, are we constantly busy or are we busy fools as managers? And I think you then summed that up, Martin, in that, are we looking at what's urgent, what's not urgent, what's important, what's not important, and what do we actually focus on? And I think I remember at Computer People having about 12 offices and rolling out a train the trainer plan to the managers so they could help train the staff, and then creating that a habit and allocating a weekly session every Wednesday for the managers and giving them material to actually go out and develop the staff. And it was really interesting. Those managers that kept saying, I'm too busy, started to become the least productive offices. And I always looked at that. And when I went back and talked to those managers, I talked to them about why. And I said, just imagine, if I gave you a ticket to go watch whatever it is you want to watch, etc. tonight, I bet you find time to do that.
Yeah.
But what you're struggling to do is find time to cover the gap that you're creating because you're missing target. And let's say that gap's 150K, because what you're trying to do is thinking, I'm the best biller in the business, I can cover that 150K. But you've got 3 people below you. Would it not be easy to get them all to do 150K extra each and train them, and then you do an extra 50K? Now you're 50K up. And it wasn't until they started to understand that they started to realize what they could actually do. And so I think when you're reviewing your managers, you've got to instill the virtue of your people development, and it's down to them to increase the team revenue. And as it's because it's easy to get 2 or 3 people to cover the gap in the target than it is for one person to put as much stress and pressure on themselves to do that and let everybody else fail, because that's not collaborative and it doesn't sort of work. And the teams that I've seen perform the best are the ones where everyone's trying to cover the gap, not just the one person or the biggest billers trying to cover the gap. So I think we've got to start to think about training our managers to actually deliver that training, have material for them to deliver that training, and instill the habit that it happens. And that would come from your weekly reviews, your monthly reviews, quarterly reviews, finding out where the gap is and what skill you need to train in those. So all the time training happens and it becomes part of the culture, not part of a necessity when we're failing.
Yeah.
So when we look at that, I always think about senior consultants, and I think they've got the hardest job. They're senior consultants moving into team leader, etc., etc. So when your senior consultants say they're too busy to coach, is different to training. How do you help leaders understand that that's a failure of planning and not a fact of life? What's stopping senior consultants and managers from coaching their teams, and how can you coach them to prioritize it without sacrificing their own target?
Well, I think it's a great question. Do you see it as a failure of planning? I always felt when I was managing people that my job, bizarrely, was to make myself redundant. I always thought that when I saw managers, and I worked for some over the years, that were nervous of people with talent and would do their best to suppress them, that was just unbelievably selfish and damaging for the business. My attitude was always the complete opposite. If I could nurture people so that ultimately they could do the job as well as me or even better than me, happy days. Because my attitude was always that if that happened, number one, I didn't necessarily want to do the job I had for the rest of my life. So I was perfectly happy for them to get my job so ultimately I could do something else. And number two, I knew that if I could cultivate and develop those people to reach a high level of performance, that actually it would create a lot more time for me. And this is back to the point that if you've got people that are performing at a very high level, they're autonomous, they know what they're doing, they need very limited levels of direction from you, and you can trust them. They're entirely motivated, not only through you, but self-motivated because they want to do well for themselves. Then you've bought yourself time. You're not having to look at everything they're doing. You can catch up with them once or twice a day, but overall, it's not going to lean into you too much. And when you've got that time, obviously you have choices to make with it. You can use that, as you should be, to spend a lot more time in front of your clients. Obviously, talking to candidates too, attending networking events, seminars, and so forth. Looking outside of the business, as all the classic management books talk about. But it also provides you with the time to spend more time coaching your people. So I think that this point is very valid, that it's about mindset. It's not about being nervous or anxious or fearful of people working for you. It's about dedicating time to them. So ultimately they grow and you create time for yourself. I think the other point here about this issue of planning, as we said, is to do with the leadership. We sometimes give our senior consultants very high targets. And I think probably the most difficult job in any recruitment business is being a billing manager. You've got a high target yourself, and your income rests on that. And you need to pay the mortgage, the rent, feed the kids, and so forth. One can understand entirely that you become very blinkered. You need to make your own money. I get that, and you've got to look at that and say, as a leader, well, is that right? Is that the right way to look at the bonus plan for that individual? My view about this issue is that if you have people who are managing others, that in my opinion, you have a collective target for that person. And in the end, it doesn't matter to you as the owner or the leader of the business that division hits the target through the entire team or through one person particularly performing well. The fact is the division hits the target and you haven't got the divisional leader with a personal target. Their target is their business's target. So if they end up generating 10% of that overall revenue, who cares? The fact is the division hit its numbers. So I think when you, as a leader, as an owner, you give your senior people high targets and then ask them to manage and coach and develop people, you're asking an awful lot. And I think that you need to step back and think that through very thoroughly.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a failure of planning, but not necessarily just on the shoulders of the senior consultant. It's a failure of planning from the leader of the business, the owner of the business, to give that individual enough bandwidth to be able to coach in the first place. And then I'd also like to raise a point that does that senior consultant know how to coach? And I'll put a plug out. How do I like this? I put a plug out for our podcast, our Recruitment Leaders Unlocked podcast. I interviewed a business manager owner last week about this, and one of their biggest learnings was that they realized that coaching and leadership was a teachable and learnable skill. They thought that coaching was innate and that you either had it or you didn't, but they've realized over time you can develop that ability to become a better coach. So giving someone the job title of a senior consultant and then saying crack on, that's negligence as a business owner. You need to make sure they've got the tools in their toolbox to be able to coach. And then the second part is also they need to have the mindset to realize that they don't get to decide when they're coaching. If you give someone the job title senior or manager in your business, you're effectively saying to junior members of staff, I validate what that person's doing. You can copy what they're doing. They have my approval. That person doesn't get to turn on and off when individuals copy them and when they're looking at them. So they have to realize that coaching isn't just something you say, right, I am now going to coach you. They also have to be aware that everything they do and how they act and how they speak and how they conduct themselves is an element of coaching as well. So again, as a leader and an owner, you have to make sure that individual understands the job description that you're giving them, they have enough bandwidth to be able to coach, and they have enough ability to be able to coach.
And I agree with what both of you said there, because I think coaching doesn't come naturally. It certainly didn't come natural to me. And that's mainly because at that time when I stepped into that job, I didn't understand what coaching actually was about. I understood what training was about because you're a classroom based and off you can go and do that classroom based training. But I didn't understand coaching. And your comment there, Martin, coaching happens anytime and anywhere. And you're right, they're looking at what you do, and that's coaching. But I always found the better way was that subtle way of developing people, listening to a single comment, listen to a single conversation, listen to a single word, and trying to change that and try and mold someone and try help someone from there. And it was rather than follow what I do, it was understanding is what they were doing and asking them the question of how can you improve that? And they would then start to coach themselves and develop themselves. And I think it was as soon as I started to understand that it's the how, not what you're doing, why you're doing that, it's how can you move that, people then start to accept you as a coach and start to accept you as someone that they will come and ask relevant questions about how they can develop. And if you are, as Paul describes it, that big biller that's billing and trying to chase your target because they've got, I make more money out of chasing my target than hitting the team target, then they're more invested in themselves. And therefore, when people come to them, it's almost like, I'm a bit scared to come and talk to you. Where I felt it was the other way. I wanted people to come and talk to me, and then I'd challenge them on how they're going to solve their own problem. And once they start to solve their own problem, they didn't keep coming and asking me time and time again. So I created that habit of when they step up to have a conversation with me, they're already thinking, Howard's going to ask me how, and therefore I should have an answer for that. And by answering it, they've already answered half the question themselves already. Sit down, therefore I'm saving time and creating my time in there. So all of a sudden, teaching people how to coach and teaching people what coaching is about develops a very different team atmosphere. And I found that those managers, and again, it goes back to that first question about how we're putting the right people in the management position, putting the right people with that mindset in that position massively helps accelerate teams' performance rather than putting the biggest biller in there that might suddenly stifle team performance. So if leaders are thinking training is something that can wait until things calm down, or once we get out of this rush, we've got to hit target, etc., how do you make them see that waiting is what's killing growth?
We go back to the point about targets. One of the things I remember learning as a young manager was that the target I had for my business was a collective target. It wasn't my personal target, me personally making the money. I know. I remember just a quick story. I remember being in my branch, as we used to have back in the Alfred Marks days, and my area manager came and spent the day in the office, and to my irritation, to be honest, because she, as far as I could tell, wasn't doing anything, whereas I was running around like an idiot all day long. And that particular week, I remember it was a Thursday, we had what we termed temp rebook, and checking in to see how many of our current temps were wanted back the following week. And of course, it was a disaster because she, just sod's law. She was there, and everybody was saying they didn't need the temps back. And I was getting more and more frantic, working so hard to try and phone every company I could think of that might give me a temp booking, exhausted at the end of the day. And she spoke to me and said, do you realize that you're the only one that's been working at that level of input? Everyone else is sitting there nice and easy all day, and you do everything. You try to do everything. You try and close their placements. You try and sell more than anybody else. You're doing everything, and they're not learning anything from you. They've got used to you just taking it all on. And my answer was, I was about 23 at the time, yeah, but I can do it better than them. And that was true. But I've actually created that situation. I wasn't putting time and effort into them to enable them to get to my level or beyond my level. I remember it very clearly. And she said, and it stuck with me all these years, Your office target is a collective target. It takes into account everybody in this office hitting their numbers, not just you trying to make their numbers for them. And I was annoyed at the time with her, but she was completely right. And this is to this point, that it's not something that you're going to wait until things calm down. You need to be aware that as a business, the targets you've set for yourself, and often just looking at your break-even position, is the collective effort of everybody in the office. And therefore, putting time and energy and dedicating time and coaching and obvious desk coaching and so forth to people is something that you have to do. We've said it so many times in this conversation. You have to do it every single day and be aware of the time that it takes to do it. And if you do, and you put the energy into it, a bit like business development, over a period of time, you'll see an improvement. But coaching every now and then makes no difference. It will not improve your people in the same way that doing the odd day of business development isn't going to transform your client base. These are dedicated tasks that need to be adhered to every single day.
Yeah. And experiential learning is the stuff that sticks with you, right? I mean,
Yep.
when I think back in my career, it's listening into those phone calls where a customer was really challenging to one of our senior consultants and they overcame the objection. And it was great. You learn from it. The stories you hear in the pub about how you turned a candidate around from a rejection to an offer. Those are the things that really stick with you. And Howard's point earlier on, I think it was Howard's point about, in remote working environments now, that's even harder to get that learning by osmosis. So as a group, I would start daily scrums with, right, what went wrong for anyone yesterday and how can we get through it, and create a culture where people are confident enough to say, yeah, I messed up on a phone call yesterday, what should I have done, and share that as a group so you learn from that experience, because otherwise you're going to lose that hands-on stuff. And I'd also say, if you are delaying training, development, coaching until things calm down, the message that sends to your business is that their personal development, their careers, their learning, and their financial earning isn't important. Or at least it's only important when you've got headroom as a business. And that's going to have a knock-on effect for morale, activities, even retention of your staff as well. So you've got to think about the messaging that's going out to the business. You have a commitment to grow these people. And I worked with the business recently where the feedback they got from an ex-team member of staff was, I struggled to do my target because I wasn't given the development and support that I was promised. So I asked the manager and the owner and his key staff, make a note of every single bit of training and development you do with your staff, not just classroom-based training, but desk side stuff. If they ask you a question on a phone call, it's 15 minutes, make a jot of that. And at the end of the month, they tallied up the hours of training they gave and published it to their business saying, per head this month, we did this many hours of training. And it was quite an impressive figure. And people in the business went, oh, right, yeah, I did get that advice and I did get that phone call. And then the next time they did an engagement survey, it ticked up because people went, this company's invested in me.
Yeah.
So the two things is prioritize it, but also push back to the business and talk to them about what you're actually doing to help develop them as well.
Yeah.
Gwyn's asked a question, and I'm going to come back to that after I've answered this question. So I think it's, I always think about a sporting analogy, and you think about what managers and coaches do after each game. They analyze performance, they review where they're weak and where they were strong, and then they start to develop a training strategy to improve performance, but looking at what the opposition is coming down the line. What they don't do is wait until the end of the season and then do all the training at the end of the season. They do it on the job as it goes, as it changes, because constantly things are changing all the way around them. So I think if we're starting to talk about, waiting for when things calm down, it's too late. It's massively too late. And, growth isn't simple. It's a really hard thing to do, but it's about creating that environment where everything around it is fertile and things want to grow. And it's hard to grow when you don't create a fertile environment. And I think you've got to start to think as a coach, you've got to be there every single day, encouraging, supporting, driving people to do the right things as well as yourself. And sometimes people in the middle of middle management are not only coaching downwards, they're sometimes having to coach upwards as well. And I think that's about the whole mentality. And that leads sort of into Gwyn's question, what comes first? Task training and coaching, or attitude training and coaching? And is attitude even coachable? And I think some attitude is coachable, but Most attitudes aren't. And that goes back to a recruitment process of bringing the wrong people into the business or promoting the wrong people with the wrong attitude into leadership roles. Coaching skills is absolutely every day. Every single day you can coach and you can improve skills. And if you go back to that, I remember sat in a changing room with Fran Cotton, who had just come back from leading the Lions, and his conversation was, how do we improve by 1%? Every single one of you walk around this team and tell me how you improved by 1%, which we all did. He then said, right, okay, now tell me how much you need to improve by a player if you want to be an international or a thing. And people going 100%, 30%, 40%. But if you improve by 1% every game, then we're going to be far better. That's a 15% improvement on the last game. So let's really drive that improvement. And all we were looking at was that marginal gain, that marginal thing. But he was walking around whispering into everybody's ears about the things that they could improve, the things that they've seen. And because you've got someone there who's of a level that people will go bow down to, that got through to players really quickly. And it was really simple. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't hard work, but it was happening every second of every training session, every playing session, every time you're having a drink, those little coaching things were coming in.
And Howard, I mean, you make a reference to culture there. I think it's really important to look at the culture in your business, because people will, over a period of time, adopt the culture of the business. So when we talk about attitude is influenced very greatly by the culture that you work within. So it's not always the case, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute, Gwyn, that this is your position, but it's not always the case that you look at an individual and think, well, their attitude is wrong and they're to blame. Sometimes the attitude of an individual is very much influenced by the culture of the environment they work within. So I think it begins with looking, as you said, described very well there, Howard, how do we improve the culture of our organization? Now, if that is then, you're very comfortable that the culture in your business is the right kind of culture, and then your point is very valid. Maybe you've got the wrong person. But I think it begins with looking inside and identifying whether the culture in your own company, and Martin makes the point, if it's a learning culture and people feel valued, feel developed, they're much more likely to stay and perform well than if they feel that they're just a part of the furniture and everyone ignores them.
I think it raises the point as well, Howard, whose responsibility is training in a business? And we ignore quite often the individual themselves. What I love about your story is the question was, what do you need to do to get 1% better? And then the answer is, right, how can I help you get there? But there's an ownership and an accountability on that individual to know where their weaknesses are and say, I need help, guys. I think that's really powerful as well.
Yeah. And sometimes it is about looking in the mirror, isn't it? What can you do for yourself to do that? And from there, let's move on to the next question, sir. How do you help billing managers stop seeing team development as a distraction from billing and start seeing it as a reason that they succeed long term?
Well,
I think, Paul,
I
you've
did
answered
already pretty much answered that already. I'm sorry about that. I mean, I think that it is, come back to my point, this is about the mindset of leaders. I said, and I do believe this very strongly, that bonuses or commission plans dictate behavior. And I think as leaders of a business, we need to look at our remuneration packages and the way in which we appraise people, the way in which we develop people, to adopt, to get them to behave in the right way. And if we are comfortable that's what we're doing correctly, then I think it's about making people realize that the development of their team is super important, enables them, to the individuals that are leading that team, to develop and grow, move on to more senior roles. We get into the whole question then of succession planning. It also gives people that work for those managers, those leaders, the opportunity to be promoted, which is going to sustain their development and keep them within the business, hopefully for many, many years. We're investing in people. I made this point earlier, and the investment shouldn't be a short-term investment. You want good quality people to be with you many, many years. So I think that this point is very valid. It's getting them into the right mindset and making sure that they understand that the development of their people ultimately brings in a lot more money in the longer term, medium to long term, and helps them and their team to grow within the organization. So again, it's a cultural issue. If you're putting pressure on your managers and it's all short-term thinking, and I know that we are famously focused on that as an industry. What's Monday's figures going to look like? how many placements we're going to make this week, how many contractors or temps are we going to get out. We've always been that way. I've been doing this job for over 50 years now. It's never really changed. But if your focus is just purely short term, then that, I'm afraid, is going to be your fate, that you live from week to week. You have to be able to look beyond that. You have to put time into your medium to long term strategies every week and every month. And if you fail to do that, then yes, you'll stumble from week to week. And therefore, people are not likely to develop in your business or not likely to stay in it for very long. So it is about the balance, and it's making sure that you believe and you work on your own culture, which in turn, I think, dictates the mindset of the people working for you.
Yeah. And I agree with the commission plan. I mean, I'd hate to think I was a coin operated recruiter, but I remember vividly when I was given my first long-term incentive plan. So I was used to month end and then quarterly and then annual commission schemes, but I was given a 3-year long-term plan that demanded year-on-year growth. But I then straight away started thinking and making decisions for long-term, stable, repeatable growth. And I started investing in hires that I made and moving people out that weren't going to get me to that 3-year goal. So just that simple structure, and it was quite interesting sums of money for me. But as a business, you can accrue for that over a 3-year period. You can put it aside, and if you get to that number, who cares? It's self-funding. But it really changed my mindset as a leader to start looking at my team, my individuals, the customer base that I had. Is it going to get me to my 3-year goal? And it just changed my mindset overnight.
I think this comes into several layers. I think it comes into promoting the right people into management in the first place and not just pushing your big billers into there. I think it also comes into, too often we promote people into management, but then never give them the tools to actually manage. And that includes your team leaders. And I think the team leader billing manager position is the hardest role in recruitment. And I think that comes down to what Paul said earlier about how you set your commission structure up. If I'm still getting 100% of my billings on my own personal, and I'm only getting 4 or 5%, which is the average of my team billings, then where am I going to focus? I'm also going to focus. But if I suddenly change that it's billing on the whole team, then all of a sudden that's where my behaviors change. And I start to look at that. But I think the change happens is when you're promoting the right people and setting out a long-term management plan from team leader to billing manager to non-billing manager, and what training and development they're going to go through for that. And I've been working with a number of companies that are now on second, third sessions of, we do a day a month for 5 months of management training. And then I'm now on the second and third set of people coming through that management training. And what they're seeing is a massive difference on how the floor operates, because they've got managers who know how to manage. It's all managing the same way. They've got people under there that've gone through that management training that are also now assisting the managers, and it starts that snowball effect that people are all pushing that way. So I think promoting the right people is key. Training them before they get into that position is even better. But setting out that long-term management plan with a training incentive plan inside it helps them to actually understand what their job as a manager is, rather than their job as a biller. And there's very differentiations there. Your job as a biller is to bill. Your job as a manager is to make your team bill and hit that team commission, or the team targets to say. So the question then that leads to is, when was the last time you coached a leader to measure their success, not by their billings, but by performance and the progress of their team? And I think as we've managed some big businesses and some big teams, and we're coaching lots of businesses. So I'm really interested, when was the last time that you get to, led or coached your people to measure that by success, not by billings, their management team?
I'll give you a very current example. I won't mention the business, but it's quite a decent sized company, nearly 100 people. And they have a particular manager who's been with them a long time, who's utterly delightful, amazing personality, an absolute asset to the business. She's completely adorable. She's now been given 9 people to manage. They wanted to push to 15. It's too many people. And I've had that conversation. If you want people to be really effective managers, I think the common law is that rule is that 6 people max, really 7 if you're pushing it. You'll get more out of people if they have small numbers of people to supervise. If the more people you give them, the less likely there is a chance of them being able to develop them. And I think this particular individual has never been coached to really study data, to look at the metrics in the business. As far as she's concerned, she's been brought up to believe that metrics, KPIs, are there to beat her up and her team with. And she, as a result, has become very defensive towards those people. And the management of the business see her as a blocker. They see her as the defender of the people that work for her. Every time they feel that somebody's underperforming, she leaps to their defense. So she doesn't see herself as a part of the management team. She sees herself as that defender of the staff. And I've been working with her to try to get her to see how a business runs, how metrics can make a difference, how looking at standard KPIs, basic metrics, can make a difference. She wants to bring in additional resources. She has a point, I would add, but she hasn't sat down and figured out how that would improve the productivity and indeed the performance and the revenues of the team. And as a consequence, when she's raised this with her managers, people aren't interested. They just see it as an extra expense. So I think that this point about coaching people to understand they're running a business, whether that is 1 or 2 people or ultimately a much bigger team, and that comes down to the management of the company. And you have to, I think it's a great thing for growth if you're that person being developed in that sense, that instead of just being seen as a biller, as somebody that is going to make money for themselves and for the business, you're now being coached to run a business, to manage a business, to understand how a company and a business works, its P&Ls. Then I think you're getting somewhere with that person, and they're likely to make much more sensible, sound, pragmatic decisions. So when we look at this question, it's about performance of the team, not the billing of an individual. You have to start to think about educating the people that work for you to understand they're running a business, whether that's an element of it or all of it, or even if they're running their own desk to that end. That, the P&Ls and the metrics are not difficult to understand, but you need to use pragmatism, the front of your brain, not the middle part of your head, which is all about emotion.
Yeah, and having worked in large organizations, for me, it comes down to trust, in that I have to build trust with the people above me that I'm going to bring someone through and develop them because I see potential in them as a leader, but there will be mistakes. I have to allow them to make mistakes. And I see that in the customers that I'm coaching now, where even with quite small businesses where they're bringing through trainee consultants, the hardest thing to do is for that leader to step back. They've done their best in terms of development, training, and coaching, but at some point you have to let that consultant take the requirement, go on a meeting on their own with the customer, close the candidate, push back on commercials. You have to step back, but you have to do it in a way where you accept that if the outcome isn't optimum, you're not going to throw the kitchen sink at the consultant. That you have to sit back and go, how can we learn from that? How do we go forwards? What would we do differently? So that building of trust, I think, is absolutely key. And as I say, whilst I've worked in big corporates and I'm coaching SMEs and small startups, it's still the same. You have to create that environment where taking the leap to help someone get better is an environment where they can make mistakes.
It's interesting, sort of what we've talked about all the way through, and we've sort of hit the nail on the head, but then sometimes missed the nail, I think, is, what gets measured gets improved, but what we tend to measure is everything that leads up to a deal. And then we measure the performance of that deal and the revenue that comes from that deal. When actually, once I started to manage multiple managers, I was constantly talking about their team attrition. I was talking about how many individuals did they get promoted. I was talking about their team behavior, their team culture. And I was talking about how that enables the growth of their business. And the way I used to describe it to them was, as a garden, if you want your flowers to blossom, you've got to cultivate your garden. And therefore, you've got to cultivate your team. And if you don't cultivate your team, then the number of flowers that will grow diminishes. So to help with growth, you've got to prepare the land. You've got to add fertilizer. You've got to prune. And when I said prune, they were going, but you mean cut people? I said, no, pruning isn't about cutting and getting rid of the plant. Pruning is about taking the plant back to its core state so it can grow better. So therefore, we're talking about pruning bad habits, pruning bad training, bad performance and helping the whole team grow and move further. It wasn't about that. And so I put a lot of purpose on them about recruiting the right people. If you've got an ever evolving door, you're never going to get people to actually grow and develop and blossom. And therefore, it all started with the right people in the right team. And therefore, it was all about getting the right manager. And therefore, the team attrition dropped, individual promotions start to increase, the team behavior start to become a collective rather than an individual sort of one for all, created a team culture. And it started to really, really blossom all the way through. So I think what gets measured gets improved,
Yeah.
but you've got to remember it's not about measuring the metrics that make a deal, it's measuring the metrics that make the person and make the team. That's the difference when you start to look at really good managers. It's about the team behavior. And if you remember rightly, when we had Christian Hughes on, who's a psychologist, he was talking about the psychology of the Liverpool team. And he worked with Jurgen Klopp when he came in, and he said, these players, and he listed a whole list of players. He said, they don't fit your culture and your mentality, even though you spent millions on them. If you remove those and bring different players in with the right culture and mentality, your team will start to blossom. And you look at what they've done, and yes, you could look at what Arnie Copper's done since, Slotter's done since he took over. Didn't change one person, but improve the culture, and look at what they've done this year. And so to me, it's all about the person, about the culture. So last question, and a very quick answer to this. How do you coach leaders to recognize that if their team isn't getting better every month, they're not leading, they're just managing decline?
I think this comes down to the way you appraise people. So if all you ever do is appraise them on their financial performance, it's developing the wrong culture. So there should be discussions constantly, and particularly through whatever appraisal system you have, that is focused on the development of the people that your staff, your people look after. And maybe there are rewards around that as well. There shouldn't be, in my opinion, but there can be. So I think it comes down to making sure that people are consistently educated and that they are measured, as you said correctly. You're monitoring things, you're measuring things, Howard, and I think that this is a measuring item. How are the people working for our people developing? Are they getting any better? And therefore that appraisal system is a constant. Martin made a quick reference to it earlier about daily meetings, and I think that's part and parcel of this same discussion.
And I love this question because of the word better, not just bigger. It's not just saying get more heads in the business, get more revenue in the business. Better suggests an effectiveness, productivity, quality. And I always learn something from you, Howard. But that thing about pruning out bad behaviors, I think, is perfect because the current climate we're in now requires different behaviors than the one maybe 5 years ago. So there are good people in your business who built up bad habits that need to be pruned so they can focus their time on more sales focused business development habits. So that leadership role is changing. It's about making better, not just bigger.
Yeah. You got a compliment there, Howard. Did you catch it?
I did catch it.
Is he blushing?
I am blushing. No, it's bizarre. But there you go. But no, I think that word better, and it was interesting when I sort of wrote the questions, I had improve. I was trying to find the right word, and better sort of really fitted it because it is about making the team better. And it goes back to that 1% conversation. If you can make your team better by 1%, and you make everyone collectively better by 1%, that's growth. And that starts to lead that. And therefore, you're not declining. And some days you've got to accept that you're going to grow. Some days you've got to accept that you're going to go backwards. And it's when you go backwards, that's when it starts to really matter as a business, that you start to say, right, I can go backwards one day, but then I've got to look to how do I improve that one day. And so you keep thinking, resetting the bar every single day, because one day you might have had a day where you've been brilliant. Okay. Next day, it's not been so great. So you set the bar on each individual day and try and beat each individual performance from the day before as a manager. And that might be sales performance, but it might be behavioral performance, attitude performance, and things like that. And it's those little attentions to details that I think starts to make teams better. And it's the attention to detail on the human interaction that people have with each other that starts to create the collective and collaborative improvement of any team. What's interesting there, Martin, you mentioned it, that Recruitment Leaders Unlocked podcast, the first podcast we've done on growth, a lot of it resulted back to culture. No matter the size of team, we've just done and just finished the next 4 podcasts, which will come out in 4 weeks' time. And those podcasts are all about leadership, and it's really interesting. I've listened to 2 of them already, and the one that I've done. And again, there's some really good in-depth learning. So if you haven't found it, go to our website, look at it on our website, go to YouTube, find it on our YouTube channel and all good podcast channels. Next week, we are just about to put out a new ebook. So next week on Wednesday, we'll release an ebook which will be of the podcast, and it will give you all the relevant information, etc. So if you want that, please write to us with all your name and address and where we can send it to, and we'll send that from there. We just had a final question. Not a question. Thanks for the webinar. Very informative and reassuring. I have to go now, so thank you. To see you. See you next time. Gwyn, you go, mate. Have your lunch, and we'll see you next time. Ladies and gents, Paul, Martin, thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you all in a fortnight's time for the next one. We're going to actually talk about leadership as well, and different leadership styles, and how that can help manage your business and grow your business. Ladies and gentlemen, Martin, Paul, thanks for your time. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care. Enjoy the sunshine.
Enjoy.